He sang all the old sea shanties that had come across from the old world, and by which men like him had pulled ropes for generations. And he sang the East Coast sea songs that celebrated the sealing vessels of Northumberland Strait and the long liners of the Grand Banks and of Anticosti, Sable Island, Grand Manan, Boston Harbor, Nantucket, and Block Island. Gradually, he shifted to the seemingly unending Gaelic drinking songs, which their 20 or more verses and inevitable refrains, and the men in the shanties smiled at the coarseness of some of the verses, and at the thought that the singer's immediate audience did not know what they were applauding nor recording to take back to old staid Boston. Later, as the sun was setting, he switched to the laments and the wild and haunting Gaelic war songs of those spattered Highland ancestors he had never seen. And when his voice ceased, the savage melancholy of 300 years seemed to hang over the peaceful harbor and the quiet boats and the men leaning in the doorways of their shanties with their cigarettes glowing in the dusk, and the women looking to the sea from their open windows with their children in their arms. Hi, I'm Ian. Today we're talking about Neil Rosenberg's The Enigmatic Symbol. The full title is actually Folklore in Atlantic Canada, The Enigmatic Symbol. This is a peculiar reading. It comes from what's called the Marco Polo papers, although you wouldn't recognize that by looking at the cover of the book. A colloquium on literature set by the Atlantic Canada Institute, I believe was the name of the organization. The Atlantic Canada Institute. I had it right. And this was their first colloquium, and they met in 1975 or 1976. And so this article is about, the whole colloquium was basically about Atlantic Canadian literature and sort of the influence of the past and what is it? Is there such a thing as Atlantic Canadian literature? And as often happens, particularly in areas that they are that sort of define themselves according to issues of traditional and issues of smallness, they sometimes invite a folklorist around. And the folklorist actually has to, with the expectation that sort of they will be talking about stories, talking about something sort of the quaintness, the very thing that we have this idea of what constitutes folklore. And Neil shows up and he problematizes the very thing that he studies. And basically that one of the first goals of the folklorist is to try and convince people precisely what is meant by folklore. It isn't simply this stuff that's lingering, this genteel, kindly, quaint inheritance. It is actually an insight. It's a mode of insight into, or means of insight, I should say, into what is found meaningful by the participants themselves. And that meaningfulness doesn't necessarily need to be something that we are comfortable with. He starts off with that discussion quoted by, I think it's George Story. It is just a history professor of some description at Memorial, and encountering a piece of folklore study and teaching a piece of folklore study, Montel's work in Kentucky, and coming across a racist epithet and asking whether it happens in Newfoundland. So, Newfoundland doesn't have that same sort of prejudice. And then, well, what about the anti-Semitic stuff in the downtown? Doesn't that sort of qualify? And someone said, that's just part of our quaint old-fashioned folklore. So clearly tongue-in-cheek. He then quotes from Alistair MacLeod's The Island. Alistair MacLeod's The Boat. It was anthologized eventually in his complete short stories, which is called The Island, hence my momentary confusion, because it's right in front of me. And The Boat is deals with a professor. The narrator is a professor, but he's thinking back on his father's life. His father, who always wanted a life of literature and a life of the intellect, but he was on the fishing boats, and that was something that was never available to him. And this one episode where he is in the summer season, his daughters convince him to take a bunch of tourists on the boat, and then he sings at them for a number of hours, and they are and he's performing. He is performing for this crowd, and that's the ambivalence, the enigma, the enigmatic symbol that Rosenberg is talking about. And he then also points to an article that came out on Saturday night. Stacey Gwynn, I believe her name was, and she talked about how people were fundamentally strip mining the folklorists at the university at Memorial, where Neil was. The folklore department of Memorial University, Newfoundland, was basically populated by Americans and a couple of Brits, and that they were coming to strip mine. It's an interesting allegory or an interesting analogy, and the idea of some kind of resource that was taking place. So, I mean, he's pointing to the fact that the folk themselves, as it were, the people of Newfoundland, the people of Atlantic Canada, are on one hand perfectly content to celebrate the traditions, the performances, the narratives that come down, while at the same time, even they recognize that it might be problematic, that it's complicated because it's grounded in lived experience. And things that are grounded in lived experience are going to always be complicated because lived experience is a complicated factor. So it is not necessarily always going to be pristine, but knowing that they are then reflectively seen as a place where tradition still exists, as if tradition didn't exist elsewhere. And so they become these objects of study. They become this sort of item of wonder, like, look, Atlantic Canada, where tradition still lives. And you have all these tourists. In MacLeod's story, it's the tourists from Boston. In Gwyn's article, it's basically the anthropologists from the United States, and now taking this almost touristic enterprise of looking at the traditions of a place and professionalizing, but professional tourists, as it were. And he isn't saying, I mean, he is being grouped in. Rosenberg himself is being lumped into that characterization of a strip mining anthropologist. So he's taking a certain amount of issue with it, but he understands the point. For one thing, he's not an anthropologist; he's a folklorist and wants to make that clear. But more than anything, he's like aware of that he and a number of like-minded people have this obstacle of the legacy of prior folklorists and or anthropologists, or whatever you want to call them, and the legacy of tourism and the legacy of this sort of fascination with Atlantic Canada that others have had, this place where time stands still. And it's a problem. And he's like, this isn't what we do. And I was talking to the people in the colloquium. It's like, this is not what we do. We're not studiers of the quaint. We're studiers of the dynamisms of tradition. We're not simply interested in these old texts or these old songs or these old belief practices, which we can hold up in this strange form of like arm's length veneration. Like, isn't this thing great? But this thing is also sort of a demonstration. The quaintness of this thing is demonstration almost in a metonymic way of the, almost more it's like a kind of form of synecdoche of the quaintness of the very place itself and the quaintness of the people and how that's actually a limiting factor. So he talks about like the analogies of folklore as some kind of natural resource that is somehow like a natural resource, like the metaphor of strip mining, is finite, in that the people are coming to take it as if it's a zero-sum game. But that analogy is a problem. And he's also pointing to the fact that so often there has been collection without analysis, that it is just an inventory of stuff. And an inventory is all very well and good. And you need to collect. Collection is part of the folkloristic project. But you're not collecting because they are, you're not collecting just cause. You're not collecting for the sake of collections. You're not collecting for the sake of collectania. And sadly, that is often the case. He points to Michael Taft's recently published bibliography, when this came out in the mid-'70s, of Taft's Bibliography of Nova Scotian Folklore, and it's like 750 items. It's a very thick index. Most of it's just lists. Most of it is just, here's some stuff, here's some stuff, here's some stuff, here's some stuff, and that's, it's not that great. It's not that useful. It's useful, no, sorry, let me rephrase. It's useful, but it isn't that profound. It isn't trying to do anything to put that in context. It isn't trying to locate these things in history, and it isn't trying to, and it takes them away from the idea that these are performances that are done by actual people. And it's the anonymizing nature of what a lot of early folklore scholarship did that is problematic, because it's the idea that these texts just are. They just exist somehow independent of the people who perform them. And that the people who perform them are in the what I often say, like the unfortunate conduit that this stuff travels through, as opposed to people who are actively engaged in taking what for them is precedent, not necessarily an enshrined, needing to be protected canon of repertoire, but just like the stuff we know, and bringing it forward into the next iteration through their own performances, and feeling free as they understand themselves to be. And sometimes they recognize that there's only so much play they can do, and sometimes they recognize that there's a lot of play that they can do. And that depends on their understanding of audience and their understanding of the role of this particular thing in their own group. But making it their own, re-performing it, recreating it. It is based on precedent, yes. It is based on something that is known to the group, yes. But new forms can be introduced, and the new forms are introduced because they are suitable in the same kind of context as the old forms. And even by saying new and old, I'm already dichotomizing, and sometimes you just need to in order to make the model clear. But we want to recognize that the intelligent people who do folklore, the folk themselves, are capable of these questions of reflectivity, of reflection and reflexivity, but aren't always engaged in them. And the fact that they're not always engaged in them is not a deficiency in their performances. And I think, ultimately the issue is that when you start collecting, and then you have this sort of critical mass of collection of weird things, oddities, cool old-timey stuff, you have this idea of perpetuating quaintness. And by perpetuating quaintness, you sort of keep it in this very strange form. And it's akin to Said's idea of Orientalism. Edward Said had this keyword, this concept that he came up with called Orientalism, which was basically this, I think I have the definition here, yeah. The West essentializes Middle Eastern, Asian, and North African societies as static and undeveloped, thereby fabricating a view of Oriental culture, and Oriental was the word of choice in the 1970s, and he's specifically using it in its slightly more specific idea of, as in the Orient and the Occident, the East and West, and he's not associating Oriental with race. He's associating Oriental with place. So the word is more uncomfortable than it has been in the past. But he himself, and he's Palestinian born, which doesn't necessarily mean that he's allowed all license with language. But I mean, he's making a point that they have taken the East and essentialized it. So let me continue. Thereby fabricating a view of Oriental culture that can be studied, depicted, and reproduced. Implicit in this fabrication is the idea that Western society is developed, rational, flexible, and superior. And I've maintained that that's one of the things that Central Canada has done and North America has done with Atlantic Canada. It's not only with Atlantic Canada, but it's happened a lot in that because of this sort of provinces of history idea, because of this one of the earlier places to be colonized, and one of the places that then didn't necessarily get the same amount of mass amounts of capital, mass amounts of political power, mass amounts of development as Central Canada. the East becomes enshrined and essentialized as a sort of like, the East Coast, the Atlantic Canadians, the Maritimers, what a jolly source. And that the culture becomes something that is celebrated, but through this lens of quaintness that keeps things at an arm's length. Like, these people can't be in actual positions of power. No, they don't get a seat at the table, but gosh darn it, we love them. And what's more, we kind of see ourselves in them, but in the distant past. So it's this framework that's in place. I mean, he talks about some other things. He talks about Carol Henderson Carpenter's work on the study of folklore in Canada and how it has largely been this matter of collection. And that, one of the things that regionalism and ethnicity of the places have been sort of branded as ethnic based on the colonial settlers. If he's not even mentioning First Nations, I think in large part because even Neil, reasonably super cool Neil, was that legacy of colonial erasure was so prevalent that we hadn't started asking the questions really about, well, what about the founding peoples? What about First Nations? So, I mean, there's a conspicuous absence in that. But he would be aware of the literature. He'd be aware of people like Jack and Speck. And so he's sort of aware of this essentializing aspect. It's not being brought to the table, in large part because maybe he recognized that, at least at this time, the conversation wouldn't make any sense to a bunch of literary types at this particular colloquium. So the Confederation brought a certain amount of in theory equivalency to the provinces and all regions of Canada, but we recognize that isn't necessarily the case. So he has this quote on page 81, which I just want to quickly read. Folklore studies reflect the social and political pressures created by variance. It is this variance which prompted the government to investigate bilingualism and biculturalism and ultimately led us to the concept of multiculturalism. Henderson points out that the prominent, if not dominant, motivation for much folklore scholarship in Canada has arisen from a sense of political, economic, and social inferiority. Such scholarship is bound to neglect important facets of the material, especially those aspects which indicate that certain kinds of folklore can be found in all groups, regions, and classes. Likewise, such studies rarely make the point that regardless of differences in the content of folklore from group to group, the social and creative processes which underlie it are often similar. And, as has already been shown, unaesthetic and derogatory forms are avoided. Instead, we have collections which parade the unique and colorful folklore of various have-not groups and regions. And that's sort of the problematizing thing. And it's the thing that he is trying to work at this point in the mid-1970s. He and the other members of the folklore department are fighting against that tendency of folklore scholarship as it has been practiced. So folklore as a study, whether it goes by that name or not, but the investigation of traditional culture by outsiders has been viewed with a certain amount of suspicion, because the idea that it's a form of ongoing economic or political domination from outside, that doesn't necessarily mean that the pride in the local is any less. It just means that the control over it is being slightly ceded to outsiders, whether literally in terms of like we'll have other people come and study our culture, or we are going to frame it in terms of ways that are going to appeal more to the tourist. That they want quaint, we'll give them quaint. Why? Because, quite frankly, this is now an industry. This is now a means of support, and so I will eyes every buy that I can see if it's going to help me pay, to feed my family. But so then they become sort of enshrined in this stereotype. And again, referring back to the island, referring back to MacLeod's The Boat where this person who is not stereotypical, yes, he works on the fishing boats, and yes, he knows these songs, but he's also immersed in the world of literature and literary magazines, and this is the life that he would have wanted. He's not. He doesn't inhabit that stereotype, but he can when it suits the expectations of outsiders, and that's the enigma. When am I on a stage? When am I being? When am I not necessarily being my authentic self in order to appease the expectation of some non-local who has a certain amount of either political or economic power that I'm in need of? And hence this ambivalence, hence this enigmatic symbol. I like this article a lot, this chapter. It's very obscure. I mean, it's just a tiny little thing. And Neil has never sort of republished his works and sort of his smaller pieces in some kind of collected works of smaller pieces, which would be interesting because some of it's been incorporated into larger works, but not much. He has these stray embers that should really be corralled. But I digress. So it's a very obscure piece, but I like it because he is basically here saying no. No, the idea that you have about what folklore is, both folklore as a discipline and folklore as a practice within culture, or folklore as a layer of culture, is incorrect. But because people like you, Colloquium attendees, are the ones who have been determining what is of interest within traditional culture and what is of, and how this place will be defined. Folklore practice has been that, accidentally, historically. And it needs to stop. It needs to stop essentializing. It needs to stop engaging in this kind of a Canadian Orientalism. And it needs to sort of figure itself out. And so even though the practice of folklore had already started to change in Atlantic Canada by the time he put this out, this kind of forms a de facto line in the sand. That you sort of have a let's just say 1970, 1975, and you have a post-1975, where prior to that, you were the plurality, the majority, and maybe not quite all, but most of the study of folklore in Atlantic Canada was collection of the quaint. And after, it's like, no, we're going to look at people, we're going to look at processes, we're going to look at dynamics, we're going to look at all aspects of a culture, the glamorous and the unglamorous both, the old-fashioned and the new, the artistic communication in small groups. We're going to embrace this revolution in folkloristics that had happened in the States and in Europe in the 60s and 70s, and this is what we were going to do. We recognize that we're doing it in a place where tradition and culture and heritage are all capital H words, because there's all this economic apparatus that's built up around them that is both sometimes needed and necessary, but at the same time resented. So how do we do this? It's a wonderful article. So that was Neil Rosenberg's Folklore in Atlantic Canada, the Enigmatic Symbol. I am Ian. I wish you nothing but the best. Be well.